Hi everyone, happy Tuesday. I've got another book review for you today. And this is the continuation of a book I've already reviewed last year, about 6 months ago. But this is volume 2, and I'll tell you about that in a second. The book is Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar by Simon Sebag Montefiore. There you go. So, Simon Sebag Montefiore's book is volume 2 of his 2-volume biography of Stalin, which covers roughly, this volume 2 covers roughly the years from the Russian Revolution to Stalin's rise to power, which happened in the late 20s, mid to late 20s, and then to his, of course, follows through with his own death in 1953. This volume was actually written 4 years before volume 1, so he wrote the second half of his life first, and then later published the book that I've already reviewed, and a link to which there is a link to this review also on my Goodreads, and there's also a video review of it on my booktube channel. This volume 1 was called Young Stalin. This covers about the first 35 to 39 years of his life. It takes you right up through the very beginning of the revolution, and volume 2 takes you from the revolution to 1953. So, while Montefiore places Stalin's psychological formation at the forefront of the first volume, which covers in large part his childhood, as you would think, his approach here looks more like a group biography of the major figures in the Politburo, or what the author refers to as Stalin's court in the title. With the Generalissimo, Stalin clearly taking center stage. Stalin's second wife and children, especially his daughter Svetlana, get copious attention, but so do many of the people in his, like I said, his inner circle, some of whom were Vyacheslav Molotov, Lazar Kaganovich, Nikolai Yezhov, Anastas Mikoyan, Andrei Zhdanov, and maybe the most famous one, if you recognize any of these names, you might know the name of Lavrenti Beria. More about him at the end of the review. The dynamics of Stalin's leadership can't really be understood without understanding the way that he did and sometimes did not get along with some of these major personalities that he worked with. Politics, economics, and culture all eventually pop up in their turn throughout the book, but they collectively take a back seat to the really riveting interpersonal dynamics of the main characters. As much as the first volume, Montefiore's second volume is a really towering, and I don't just mean physically. It comes in at over 800 pages. That includes the end notes and the annotated bibliography and all of that good stuff. But still more impressive, I think, is his the diaries, the letters, the telegrams, and the other internal documents that he used to cobble together all of the details about the numerous alliances and rivalries that operated within Stalin's court. All the usual hoops are dutifully jumped through here. Stalin's rise to power, like I said, in the late 20s, the growth of his inner circle, the major decisions that he made during World War II, his personal life, his work habits. But over the course of the book, that little devil on your shoulder that keeps asking who's going to rub him the wrong way and disappear next keeps popping up. Stalin had no qualms about mass murder, obviously, and he didn't seem to have many more when it came to just eliminating the people that he had at one time trusted the most, trusted enough to put in the Comintern, or which is the Communist International, which was a very important bureaucratic committee in Stalin's USSR, and the Politburo. They put these people in really exalted positions, and then within a matter of hours or days, sometimes, they would disappear. And they didn't really disappear. Sometimes we don't know the details of what happened to them, but very often we did, and his fingerprints are all over it. To see these characters tiptoeing on eggshells for their entire political careers in the hopes to keep Stalin happy, but not too happy, because apparently he hated yes men and people who just always agreed with everything he said. Nothing really rubbed him the wrong way more than that. So you have to agree with him, but not too much. It's really no small wonder how this cult of personality sort of came to flourish. So together, there were three characters who were known as the Caucasian clique. I'm going to tell you about some of these people and how they met their unfortunate ends. One of these guys' names is Serge. Okay, these Georgian names can be a bit tricky. So Sergo is his first name, and his last name is spelled Ordzhonikidze, which I guess would be something like Ordzhonikidze. That's my best try. Together, him, Stalin, and another guy by the name of Anastas Mikhoyan were known as the Caucasian clique. The first two from Georgia, and Mikhoyan being an Armenian. A full member of the Politburo, Ordzhonikidze was Stalin's chief advisor on industrialization and economics. He was found dead from a gunshot wound after having irritated Stalin during a phone conversation. And the day after his death, 3 doctors signed off on a document collectively stating that he had died of paralysis of the heart. There's another man by the name of Avul Unikidze, another one of those names. He was the head of the Bolshoi Theater and the Moscow Theater for about a dozen years at the height of Stalin's reign during the 30s. He had his execution publicly announced during the Purges of the 30s, and the Purges of the 30s are another topic of fascinating historical interest that Montefiore covers very well in the biography. He was later denounced as being part of a rightist conspiracy. Rightist we can basically understand as something anything other than Bolshevik, anything to the right of Bolshevik, which Stalin just thought of as anything to the right of Bolshevism would have been counter-revolutionary. He was found guilty of being part of a rightist conspiracy by Stalin's head of secret police, whose name was Genrikh Yagoda. And then Yagoda himself, the head of the secret police, he was the victim of another show trial the next year, and he was executed. There's a man by the name of Andrei Zhdanov. Remember, all of these people are not just peripheral figures at the book. They're all the core. These are Stalin's right-hand men, right? They all do happen to be men. I guess the lives and children of many of the characters are also discussed, but the people in the Politburo who helped him run the government were almost exclusively men. There's another guy by the name of Andrei Zhdanov. He was Stalin's chief propagandist. And he was also the shaper of what we would now call Soviet-style social realism. This sort of aesthetic that we identify with social realism. And for several years, the man was actually assumed to be Stalin's successor. He dies under mysterious circumstances, maybe the result of a medical misdiagnosis, even though during Stalin's growing paranoia and anti-Semitism, which was really ramping up in the last 5 or 10 years of his life, Stalin would blame Zhdanov's death on a Zionist conspiracy. Nikolai Yesov, who was Stalin's head of the secret police, which is called the NKVD for short, head of the NKVD during the height of the 1930s Purges, he presided over the arrests of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of enemies of the state, and was also responsible for their eventual executions, too. In 1940, he was tortured into admitting that he had committed anti-Soviet activity, found guilty, and executed. Last, someone I mentioned earlier by the name of Lavrenti Beria, perhaps one of the cruelest, most evil people that Stalin knew. One of the ones who could really show the most cruelty to other people. He was the organizer of the famous massacre that happened in Katyn, which I think was responsible for the deaths of I don't know how many thousands of people. He was also the administrator of Stalin's complex series of gulags, the dozens of gulags that he had all over Siberia and the rest of the country, and one of the most ruthless members of the Politburo. He actually did escape Stalin's wrath, but only by a few months. Later in that same year, in 1956, he was quickly perceived by Stalin's actual successor, who, of course, we all know to be Nikita Khrushchev. He was perceived by Khrushchev to be a political threat. Khrushchev had him arrested and executed. Even though, interestingly, Khrushchev was known mostly for the de-Stalinization of the USSR, bringing people slowly out of the labor camps and stopping this sort of mass execution of political enemies, Khrushchev found it necessary to get rid of Beria very quickly. By the way, fascinating book that has Beria also as a central character. It's by an author I'm reading another book by, but if you want to learn some fascinating stuff about Beria, go read a book by Anne Applebaum called The Gulag. It came out, I think, in 2003. I can't believe it's 15 years old because I read it when it came out. But it is a fascinating, a big, thick, 600-page history of the organization, the building, the bureaucracy of Stalin's gulags. Fascinating. Sounds like a snooze, is a fascinating read. In a week or two, I will have a review of another book by Anne Applebaum about Eastern Europe during the immediate years after World War II. Especially how Soviet power, it's a book on how Soviet power was spread to the Soviet bloc states in Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Eastern Germany, and Hungary, countries like that. But for all of his red and tooth and claw brutality, Stalin could almost seem charming at times. He was an endless reader. Montefiore almost makes him out to be an intellectual. I'm not quite sure I would take things that far, but he was obviously a very curious person. The 1932 suicide of his second wife, whose name was Nadizhda, threw him into, I guess it would be like Nadia if you tried to anglicize it, maybe, threw him into a dizzying psychological despair. He was the son of a cobbler, Stalin was. And for the rest of his life, he was really thrown into these paroxysms of glee whenever he met another shoemaker. And he would sometimes spend hours going into mind-numbing detail with them about the technical aspects and the industry and the art making of being a cobbler. The affection he had for his only daughter, who, as I mentioned earlier, was named Svetlana, is maybe his healthiest adult relationship, a non-romantic relationship, until she started to reach young adulthood. On falling in love with a young Jewish boy named Alexei Kopler, Stalin was so furious he ordered Kopler to 10 years of hard labor in Siberia. Thanks, Dad. I liked him, and you sent him to Siberia. Despite being a lifelong flirt and lover of women himself, Stalin could be unusually prudish about his own private life and the private life of the men that he operated closely with every day. But he was never able to really conceive of his daughter as wanting to attract the attentions of men. In 1970, Svetlana married a man named William Peters, who was a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright. Her and Peters had a daughter who actually is still living. Stalin has a living granddaughter who lives in Portland, Oregon, of all places, is thoroughly tattooed and is just a total punk. You should look her up online. I don't know what her first name is. It's escaping me at the moment. Just Google Stalin's granddaughter, and you'll see what she looks like. I think she would have given her grandfather a heart attack with all the tattoos and the dyed hair and the piercings and everything. But it's fascinating to know that Stalin had, and until very recently, he had a living daughter. I think Svetlana only died maybe 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. Svetlana divorced Peters in 1973, but I knew I wrote about this. Continued living a very private life in the Midwest. She obviously wasn't a big fan of the attention she was getting, being the daughter of Stalin, until she died at the age of 85 in 2011. So she was alive up until just 8 years ago, which is interesting to think about. I guess it tells you about the historical closeness that we have with Stalin. We think about him as being some, figure in distant history, but he's very close to us historically. For all the richness of both historical and psychological experience, I would suggest, if you want the fullness of the reading experience that Montefiore is trying to communicate to the reader, go first to young Stalin. Like I said, this is his childhood up until around the age of 35, 38, something like that. And in this book, he astutely plumbs the depths of Stalin's early influences, his childhood, growing up in a Georgian backwater that really made him a rough and tumble kid. And then only in volume 2 do we see Stalin fully fleshed out as the crazed leader that we know him from history books. A crazed leader whose humanity I thought would have been almost impossible to communicate on paper. But somehow, alchemically, Montefiore manages to do it. I know that his power as a narrative historian to be able to maintain a 1,000-page biography of Stalin is there, but I mean, I didn't know I could actually be interested enough to read 2 volumes on his life. But Montefiore's books prove that biography is both a science and an art, and it was fascinating to discover the series of artistic choices he drew from to limn Stalin as a complex and confounding paradox that he was. Sorry for the overly long review. I just had a lot to say about the book. But here is volume 2 of Simon Sebag Montefiore's 2-volume biography of Stalin. It's Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. I will see you next week, guys. Bye.